a question about moral intuitions, which provides for us an interesting starting point for our investigations about moral psychology. You remember, I'm sure, that for us, moral psychology is the study of the psychological aspects of ethical abilities. And in this first part of the course, our focus is on the question, what ethical abilities do humans have, and what states and processes underpin them? So if those are our questions, I thought it would actually be good to start by thinking about a role for emotion. In particular with the question, do emotions influence moral intuitions? In part because this is a fascinating question in its own right, and in part because it's one that has attracted quite a bit of interest and controversy. Now, the first thing we need is to understand what is meant by a moral intuition. Steve, what is a moral intuition? Good question. The full answer is contained in this chapter, which I'm actually asking you to read for the seminars and do a little bit of writing about, called Moral Intuitions. So there's a clue in the title there. And that's in this book called The Moral Psychology Handbook, which rather wonderfully is available in its entirety online to you via the library. So it's very easy to get hold of this. And indeed, much else that's interesting you will find in the book called The Moral Psychology Handbook. This is the chapter to read for now, though, about moral intuitions. Okay, but I don't expect you to go and read the chapter and then come back. What I'm going to do is give you a quick and dirty introduction to moral intuitions, one that should suffice in advance of you going deeper by reading that chapter. So what are moral intuitions? Well, it might be helpful to start by saying they're unreflective ethical judgments. They're judgments which are not made on the basis of any process of deliberation, and typically when you have a moral intuition, you may not immediately be able to say why you have made the judgment that you have. You see me kicking the baby seals and punching them, and you immediately say, Steve, that's wrong, stop it. You may not have any view in particular about why that's wrong, and if I challenge you, why should I stop? It may take you a while to work out what's going on. The immediate thing is, that is wrong. So the idea. Now we can see why this might be a plausible idea by comparison with other cases. So for example, think about unreflective linguistic judgments, sometimes called linguistic intuitions. If I give you a sentence like, he is a waffling fatberg of lies, apparently this sentence has been used in connection with the national embarrassment that is the UK's current Prime Minister. He is a waffling fatberg of lies. The most immediate thing you might say to me is, Steve, that's fine, that's a grammatical sentence. By contrast, a very similar sentence, a waffling fatberg lies of he is. This is not a grammatical sentence. And many fluent speakers of English will be able to say immediately, 2, not a sentence, 1, it is a sentence. So first of all, you're able to make unreflective linguistic judgments about which things are sentences and which are not. Secondly, most people will not be able to say very much about why this is a sentence and this is not a sentence. And when you ask people to do this, ordinary language users to do this, generally what they tell you are things based on quite mistaken views about the actual syntactic structures of their languages. So what we have here is this. In the case of unreflective linguistic judgments, you can make these rapidly and you can make them confidently without knowing exactly why you're making them, and indeed without necessarily being able to say at all why they're made, without having the knowledge even that underpins them. So there does seem to be something special about unreflective linguistic judgments. Same thing for unreflective mathematical judgments. I'm about to show you 2 boxes containing a number of objects, and what I'd like you to do is just to think to yourself as quick as you can, which contains more objects? Which of the 2 boxes contains more objects? Quickly as you can. Ready? Go. So as I say, here are my 2 boxes. Now most people can say very quickly that this far box is the one with the most objects in it. Most people can do that very quickly, and they can do that in advance of being able to say why that's the case. They won't necessarily be able to say, here you've got 4 and here you've got, I suppose it's 8, something like that. And indeed, people who are incapable of counting all the way to 8 will still often be able to tell you that the far one has more objects in it than this one. So people have capacities to make unreflective mathematical judgments judgments even that they may not be able to explain, and they can do this very rapidly. So the thought is that although we're characterising moral intuitions in a very simple way, we're just saying, look, they're unreflective ethical judgments. Comparison with the linguistic and mathematical case suggests that there might be something special about these unreflective ethical judgments, the moral intuitions. They may be something different from things that are a process of complicated deliberation, as when the linguist gives you a theory about the structure of a sentence, or the mathematician comes up with a proof. Maybe unreflective ethical judgments are in some way similar. Now, one thing to highlight here is that in talking about moral intuitions, we're talking about judgments that ordinary people make in their everyday life. The mundane experience that you have when you see me kicking baby seals. I hope that isn't actually mundane, but you see something happening. You see one person hitting or punching another, and it's immediate, just that's wrong, that's wrong. This absolutely immediate sort of sense of wrongness. You see a particular political leader, and the political leader opens his mouth. It is usually a he, isn't it, across the world, and immediately you hear something, and you straight away you're like, it's wrong. It's wrong. So these are the everyday judgments. Now, in philosophy, of course, philosophers have something that they call intuitions. These are, I think, guesses that philosophers make about various matters. Philosophers make guesses about various matters, and as David Lewis says, they call those guesses intuitions. In philosophy, an intuition is a guess. But in philosophy, of course, that guess may be the consequence of a lot of thinking and training and so on. So the guesses that philosophers make, the intuitions that they have, may not correspond at all to the unreflective ethical judgments that people in everyday life make. We'll see some examples of that later. So we need to be very careful here. When we're talking about moral intuitions, we're not talking about the kind of things that philosophers, on the basis of considerable training, expertise and reflection, come up with. We're talking about unreflective ethical judgments from everyday life. Very good. So we have a first pass understanding of what the moral intuitions are. Our question is, do emotions influence them? Do emotions influence them? Now, to see why that question is significant, I actually want to introduce you to a different question, one which is based on a distinction between computing and tracking. So I think of a device or a process, and I say for that device or process to track some attribute, is for the presence or absence of the attribute to make a difference to how the process unfolds, and for that not to be an accident. This is non-accidental fact about the process or the device. So this is tracking. By comparison, I think in order for there to be computing, typically the process has to involve representations of the thing computed. This is a very simple distinction, but it can be surprisingly hard to get a fix on. So let me give you a first illustration. This is a motion detector. This is a motion detector. So there is a process in this device which will detect human motion. Now, what this device tracks then is human motion. Whether the device generates an electrical current or not depends on whether or not there are humans in motion around it, and that's not an accident. That's not an accident. That's indeed part of the whole purpose of this device. But what the device computes, this particular one, is patterns of infrared energy. In the device, there's nothing like a computation of humans or human motion, nothing like that. What the device computes is infrared energy. The reason that works is because within limits, the two things are correlated. In a useful but limited range of circumstances, the patterns of infrared energy that this device computes are patterns of infrared energy that correspond to the movement of a human. It's not perfect. It breaks down, for example, if you get a very large cat or something like that, then the correspondence will break down. But the important point is that you can track one thing by computing another. You can track one thing by computing another. And a lot of ingenuity in designing equipment, of course, is exploiting those correlations. You want to track something that's pretty difficult to compute, so you identify something that's much more readily accessible, you compute that, and it enables you to track the inaccessible thing. Very simple idea. So this distinction between tracking and computing, I'm going to be putting quite a bit of weight on in what follows. It's the basis for a question. This is the second question. What do human adults compute that enables their unreflective judgments to track moral attributes such as wrongness. So the thought here is that humans might be like that motion detector. When they're making unreflective judgments, having moral intuitions, those are judgments about moral attributes. It's wrong or it's right, it's good or it's bad, and so on. But the thing that they're computing is not necessarily any moral attribute at all. It might be. So the answer to this question might be, Steve, what they're computing are the moral attributes themselves, but it might be something else. So the question, I think, is one that makes sense and stands in good order. Now, Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues, in the chapter on moral intuitions that I'm recommending to you for the seminar reading, offer us a hypothesis which answers the question. They say that humans, in making unreflective moral judgments, rely on the effect heuristic. What's that? That's to say that when they're thinking about an act and it makes them feel bad, they judge that it's morally wrong. So what humans are computing is how an act makes them feel. And what they're tracking is the rightness or wrongness of the act. So on this view, there's a clear role for emotions in moral intuitions. Emotions are what provide or drive the moral intuitions. Now, this can be quite tricky to understand, so I want to give you a second example. Here's a question involving humans now, not motion detectors. What do humans compute that enables their unreflective judgments to track toxicity? So there you are, and you've signed up for some, awful reality TV program in a moment of weakness, horrified, terrible decision, and you've ended up in this strange environment. You've got no idea where you are, and what you've got with you are some clothes that you're wearing, and that's it. And you're hungry. So the first thing you've got to do is find some food. Now you go around and you look at some stuff around you, but none of it's very familiar, right? So what do? It looks like it might be edible, but what do? That's rude. Yes, that's right. So what you've got it, right? So what you do is you go on and you sort of grab something that looks like it might be edible and give it a sniff. Give it a sniff. Why are you sniffing it though? What are you getting out of it? Well, partly when you sniff it, you've got a sense of like, how does that make me feel? Now the smell is going to be unfamiliar. It's not going to smell like, oranges or whatever. This is an unfamiliar object. But you can still make something of the smell because even though it's unfamiliar, it will make you feel good or bad. And if it makes you feel bad, you're probably not going to eat that. But if it passes the sniff test, what you might do, what most people who do take it, is just have a little bit and just give it a very cautious lick, right? In order to examine the taste. Why are you examining the taste? It's not going to be familiar. Aha. But interestingly, when you taste the thing, again, there's going to be a reaction. There's a visceral reaction, and you can sense the visceral reaction that you have. How do you feel when you taste that thing, right? Does it make your mouth go horrible? Are you retching or are you fine with it? So it seems quite plausible that what humans are tracking here in their unreflective judgment, should I eat the object or not, is toxicity. What they're computing is clearly nothing to do directly with toxicity. You haven't brought a lab with you. You haven't got the possibility to test for various kind of poisons and so on. What you're doing is working out how encountering that thing, first of all, in terms of the smell, and secondly, in terms of the taste, how encountering that thing makes you feel. Make sense? You're tracking toxicity. What you're computing is how encountering it makes you feel. And humans are pretty good like that. This, of course, is important for human survival outside of modern societies with supermarkets where everything's labelled and so on, deceptively. So I take it this is very straightforward. Humans compute how encountering a potential food item makes them feel in order to keep track of toxicity. Very simple idea. And what we're suggesting is that exactly the same pattern occurs in the case of devices like motion sensors. There's a difference between what's computed and what's tracked. And also, but this is the speculative claim, according to Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues, effect heuristic. When you have moral intuitions, when you make unreflective moral judgments, you're tracking what's right and wrong by thinking about how the act makes you feel. What you're detecting is, how does that act make me feel? So the theory. Now this is the claim that we're interested in, but we're not taking it for granted that this is true, of course. Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues tell us they They think it's true, they offer us some arguments, but we're not going to take it for granted. We're going to critically examine the arguments and evidence. So Steve, where are we? Well, we've got a good question. I think this is not completely straightforward to understand, but it's an important question. What do adult humans compute that enables their unreflective judgments to track moral attributes such as wrongness? That's actually our question. And we've got a hypothesis to consider, the first hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that they rely on thinking about how an act makes them feel. So they just do this. If thinking about an act makes you feel bad, or encountering the act makes you feel bad, then you judge it's morally wrong. If it doesn't, then you don't. That's where moral intuitions come from. So I think you can see that this hypothesis is a straightforward answer to the second question we asked. But what about the first question? Do emotions influence moral intuitions? Well, here the hypothesis is giving us a positive answer to that question. This hypothesis says, yes, they do influence moral intuitions, and you can see moreover from the hypothesis how that works. The way, according to the hypothesis, that emotions influence moral intuitions is by grounding them, by being the thing that you are computing, the emotion, in order to track the ethical rightness or wrongness, the moral attribute, as Sinnott, Armstrong and colleagues say. So here we are. There's just one thing that we're missing. One tiny detail here. We haven't got any evidence for or against the hypothesis. So the next thing we need to do is to see whether or not there's a reason to suppose that the hypothesis is true.